Hello, Paul, and hello, Adrian.
Hello.
So before we begin, this panel is until 5 p.m. here in Spain, so you can stay for the full panel to have the question, the Q&A after your presentation, right?
Was absolutely disappearable.
Okay, let's wait for 1 more minute, and if you're all ready, I'll begin. So then we may begin. Hello, good afternoon, all of you. After the lunch break, we're coming back here. And also good afternoon to all the people who are viewing us at home. Let's begin with our first afternoon panel. So I am honored to be moderating this panel with you too. And I'm really happy to go through this experience. So I want to spend more time. So I will begin introducing you so you can begin your presentations. So the first presentation we've got this afternoon is by Dr. Leonor Martínez Serrano. First, I will introduce her a little. She is a lecturer at the University of Córdoba, Spain. Her research interests include Canadian literature, eco-criticism, and high modernism. She has co-edited a work titled Modern Eco-Poetry Reading the Palimpsest of a More Than Human World in 2021. And she has authored a work titled Breathing Air, the Polyphonic Lyric of Robert Brinkhurst in 2021. Her presentation today is titled Reading What Is, Think Power in William Carlos Williams's Spring and All. So thank you, Leonor. So you may begin your presentation.
Thank you very much for your nice introduction, Alberto. It's great to see you all. I wish I could present face to face, but I'm very busy at the moment because we're holding an international conference at the University of Córdoba. But still, I feel deeply honored to have the opportunity to present a paper which I have titled "Reading What Is in Power" in William Carlos Williams' Spring and All. I'm going to share my screen for you to see a few slides that I have prepared with some quotations. Okay, so there you are. So I've divided my presentation into 4 different parts. I'd like to begin with a very short introduction. Then I move on to a very short meditation on poetry and imagination in Williams's Spring and All. The third section will be about reading vibrant matter in this collection, and then I'd like to wrap up my presentation with some closing remarks. So let me go back to the beginning of the first section, introduction, which I've called Poetry and the Power of Imagination. Well, this is something you all know. In Spring and All was inspired by experimental Cubist techniques. It was an enigmatic and hybrid collection. It deliberately alternated poetry and prose as part of a unitary whole. And 100 years later, the collection still constitutes a remarkable contribution to 20th century poetics. Puzzling at times, the form of the book enacts its thought. So in this paper, I'd like to argue that Williams's collection is, on the one hand, a proven meditation on the power of the human imagination to suffuse the world with extra reality. According to Doyle, for Williams, the imagination intensifies a pre-existent reality. And on the other hand, it seems to me that Spring and All is also a poetic manifesto on the agency of things, which is precisely aligned with fundamental tenets of the so-called new materialisms. And I will refer to Barrett's and Bennett's contribution in this field. In Spring and All, Williams suggests that the imagination perceives things that exist as part of a vibrant whole. And that's probably the core statement I'd like to make this afternoon. Though 33 years apart, it might be pertinent to turn to the theory of poetry that W.H. Auden outlined in Making, Knowing, and Judging, the inaugural lecture he delivered as professor of poetry at Oxford in 1956, to understand the centrality of imagination to Spring and All. As you know, etymologically speaking, the word imagination is extremely interesting. It means to bring to light. And in this regard, poets are thought to get to know the world through imagination. Borrowing both terms from Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, Auden's theory subdivides the imagination into primary imagination and secondary imagination. And he conceives of primary imagination as that which is able to perceive beings and events, whereas secondary imagination he conceives as being that faculty whose main goal is the perception of beauty. Whereas the primary imagination precipitates in human beings a desire to express the awe that we experience in the face of the grandeur and ineffability of what is, the secondary imagination seeks to make the experience communicable to others by looking for the right words that will do justice to reality, to the world. And this is, according to Auden, the origin of the work of art. My hunch is that Auden's insights into the nature of imagination and what it can accomplish are also applicable to Williams's Spring and All. Early in his book, Williams announces that his address to the imagination, conceived as the single force we may avail ourselves of, and I quote, to refine, clarify, intensify that eternal moment in which we alone live. Williams' devotion to reality led him, as you know, to cultivate a highly concrete poetry, that is to say, a poetry that is firmly rooted in and nourished by the objects populating the world. And in this regard, J. Hillis Miller, back in 1966, in a book titled Poets of Reality, argued And the Williams was a post-romantic poet who created a world, and I quote, without depth or transcendence. Williams, I'd like to contend in this presentation, is a lyric epistemologist, that is to say, one who rejects acquisitive understanding and sees his own role as nominalist. So let me put it in other words. It is by naming things that they come into existence, that they come to be. The same things exist, but in a different condition when energized by the imagination, writes Williams in Spring and All. Imagination in this context reveals itself to be a fundamental faculty for knowing reality. As he notes, and I quote again, it is the imagination on which reality rides. It is a cleavage through everything by a force that does not exist in the mass and therefore cannot be discovered by its anatomization. So in this context, it seems that it's really no wonder William places the imaginative understanding of reality over argumentative thinking to shed light on what is. He notes, I've always placed art first and stem it over science in spite of everything. He was a doctor, as you know, this is a doctor speaking. Emphasizing the uninterrupted continuity of tradition in terms which are truly reminiscent of Eliot's conception of the simultaneity of all text in the Western canon in tradition and individual talent, that landmark essay that was published in 1999, Williams notes that the work the 2,000-year-old poet, meaning Homer, did and that we do are one piece. That is the vitality of the classics, end of quote. What he admires about the classic is that their composition have as their excellence an identity with life, since they are as actual, as sappy as the leaf of the tree, which never moves from one stop. And that's a quote I've lifted from Spring and All. That was, in his opinion, the vigor of their imaginative lives, of the classics. In poems of any value, ritualistic forms, rhyme, and meter do not separate the work from reality. Words serve no ornamental purpose or are sacrificed to symbolism. On the contrary, the poetical words functions, and I quote again, not as a symbol of nature, but a part cognizant of the whole, aware, civilized. The elegance and the simplicity that Williams was after is masterfully summarized in these words. The work will be in the realm of the imagination as plain as the sky is to a fisherman. Let me move on to the second section, which I've titled Reading Vibrant Matter. In Karen Barrett's Genscher realism, the concept of ontoepistemology gestures to how the self and material reality are mutually engaged through material discursive interactions. And actually, her notion of interactions replaces the old idea that objects, observers, and observations are discrete and separate entities with the new idea that these phenomena are always entangled, mutually constitutive, and co-evolving, according to Gerald Glott-Felty. As Barrett argues, eros, desire, life forces run through everything. Meeting the universe halfway, trying to apprehend a world from which we cannot be disentangled, we are just, and I quote her again, a part of that nature that we seek to understand. And in Jane Bennett's view of the agency and vitality intrinsic to the world, matter is not raw, brute, or inert, or passive stuff. Rather, bodies or things have the capacity to act as quasi-agents or forces with trajectories, propensities, or tendencies of their own. As a result, the world is not filled with ontologically distinct categories of beings, subjects, and objects, but with variously composed materialities that form confederations. In this train of thinking, Williams's experiment in Spring and All could be interpreted as being an accomplished treatise on the agency that is intrinsic to the vibrant entities populating the earth. In the opening lines of his book, the poet observes that there is a constant barrier between the reader and his consciousness of immediate contact with the world. The whole world is between. What he advocates in Spring and All is a mediated contact between the self and the world, as well as undivided attention to the proliferation of things. Life becomes actual only when it is identified with ourselves, he writes. His constant sense of the particularity of individual things is pervasive in his poetry. In fact, Williams's well-known dictum, "No ideas but in things," conveys his sense that all things are relevant, and a sense of the vividness that he was after in his poetry. Convinced of the futility of attempting to copy nature rather than rendering it, he writes in his notes in diary form the following: "Poetry should strive for nothing else. This vividness alone per se for itself, that thing, the vividness of which is poetry by itself, makes the poem." End of quote. Williams also draws a most interesting difference between prose, which, relieved of extraneous and related values, must return to its only purpose, to clarity, to enlighten the understanding, and poetry, which has to do with the crystallization of the imagination, the perfection of new forms as additions to nature. So, according to Williams, as accomplished verbal artifacts, poems are to stand next to trees, rivers, mountains, and engines. There's an astonishing enumeration of very disparate elements at some point in Spring and All. So in what follows, I'd like to explore how Williams reads think power in the vibrant web of what is. Celebratory in tone, Spring and All sings of beginnings, of spring, the resurrection of all life with the coming of the new season. Williams is concerned with perception, and the vitality inherent in the world is discernible in the meditative coherence of poems 1, 2, and 3, in very opening pages of Spring and All, particularly in the first poem, Spring and All, which is a poem of birth and embodies process. A confederacy of entities from the natural world, comprising mottled clouds, a cold wind, muddy fields, standing water, tall trees, bushes, and small trees, is carefully assembled to evoke a landscape where one by one, and I quote, objects are defined. It quickens clarity out of leaf. The co-presence of all these details from the natural world, from the known human world, is, and I quote, according to Doyle, a discovery of order among them, detached from ordinary experience to the imagination. Direct realism in art is bewildering because, as Williams says, the only realism in art is of the imagination. Point number 2 illustrates Williams' conviction, regarding the futility and the falseness of attempting to copy nature. It also aptly reminds readers that perception is how we humans, quite literally embodied minds, interact with and respond to the multiformity of stimuli and the exuberance of phenomena punctuating the world. Perception is transcorporeality at its most basic form. The piece is another celebratory poem that sings of spring as it manifests in flowers, and I've selected some illuminating lines from poem number 2. Petals radiant with transparent light, and the leaves reaching up their modest green from the pot's rim. Point 7, number 7, is a response to poem number 2 in that it keeps on exploring the morphology of flowers. The fragility of the flower, unbruised, penetrates spaces. The simplicity of this poem is strikingly enriched by the account of how petals reach upwards into the unknown recesses of the universe. From the petal's edge, a line starts that, being of steel, infinitely fine, infinitely rigid, penetrates the Milky Way. And point number 3 constitutes an ars poetica in miniature, where Williams meditates on what valuable poetry is all about. The poem is worth quoting in full, that's why I'm showing on this slide. The farmer in deep thought is pacing through the rain among his blank fields with hands in pockets. In his head, the harvest already planted. A cold wind ruffles the water among the brown widths. On all sides, the world rolls coldly away. Black orchards darkened by March clouds, leaving room for thought. Down past the brushwood, bristling by the ring-slewed worn road, looms the artist's figure of the farmer, composing antagonist. The farmer is a figure representing the poet, and in Williams's profoundly ecological view of poiesis, poetry of any value remains as close as possible to the nourishing earth, particularly in this poem. Cultivating the art of poetry is tantamount to practicing the skill in recording the eros running through all things, the force running through all things, as well as the moment, and I quote, when the consciousness is enlarged by the sympathies and the unity of understanding which the imagination gives, end of quote. Attracted by the universality of things he mentions in point number 10, Williams says, works of art must be real, not realism, but reality itself. In point number 3, the one you can see it right now, constellation formed by the rain, the blank fields, the cold wind, the water, the brown widths, the black orchards, and the water, and the March clouds, is a constant reminder that nature is where poetry comes from, and that it is valuable because it possesses the quality of independent existence, of reality, which we feel in ourselves. It is not opposed to art, but opposed to it. Feeling the force of life at work in every little thing he tends to look or listen to, Williams experiences what he called in a letter to Marion Moore, a nameless religious experience which led him to accept the world as part of myself, he said. This is probably the greatest epiphany at the core of Williams's poetry. But the majority of Williams's poems in Spring and All offer epiphanies as conceptualized by James Joyce and Stephen Hero, the first draft of the Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, as the perception of the ultimate significance of ordinary things, a sense of heightened reality. Upon his encounter with vibrant objects, Williams creates poems that embody an anti-transcendental mysticism, a vision of the spirituality of individual things, which can unite subject and object without necessarily implying any escape from ordinary reality, according to Lever. But what the Epiphany accomplishes is that it reveals things as they are, but as they are in their particular essences. What is revealed is the ideal form of the thing in the thing itself, its quietus, its soul. In Williams's hands, poetry literally focuses the world. As he notes in his essay, it was a proposal for a magazine. Time and again, he gestures to the non-transcendental union of subject and object that happens in the acts of perception. Not in vain, Martin Heidegger claimed that poets are the shepherds of being, and that the poetical word has the power to uncover or to unconceal being. Ultimately, the vigor of Williams's poetry lies in his ability to describe a simple world in simple language and convey an exaltation close to mystical, but grounded in immediate fact and mysticism of particulars. So thank you very much for listening.
Alberto, tienes que ponerte el audio, por favor.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry. So, Leonor, thank you very much for your presentation. It's been such a pleasure to listen to it. Later, we'll say something about it. Just to let you know, we've got some students here also listening to you, to both of you. I think it's going to be a really nice beginning of the afternoon. So now I would like to introduce Professor Paul Cappucci. It's also an honor to have you here attending this conference. So I will tell the attendees here some facts about you to introduce you first. So Professor Cappucci is a professor of English at Georgian University in Lakewood, New Jersey. He published a work titled William Carlos Williams, Frank O'Hara, and the New York Art Scene in 2010. More recently, he published There Is a Kind of Revival You Would Dig Taking Place, William Carlos Williams, and the Beat issue of the Black Mountain Review. This piece has been published in a collection titled The Beats, Black Mountain, and New Modes in American Poetry, edited by mapeado and published by Clemson University Press in the year 2021. Professor Cappucci has also an essay forthcoming in Renaissance entitled "No One Can Instruct You, Denise Levertov, William Carlos Williams, and a New Direction in the Jacob's Ladder." So today, Professor Cappucci is going to give us a presentation with the following title: Denise Levertov, William Carlos Williams, and the Sacredness of the Imagination. So thank you, Professor Cappucci. We are honored to listen to you today. Thank you.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, and thank you for making this possible. I'm so honored to be a part of this conference and to share some of the ideas that I've been working on. I'm going to read the paper formally, but I'll start. In an interview with Ian Reid, Denise Levertov admitted that, quote, "Stylistically, I don't think my later work is that obviously Williams influenced, but his spiritual influence changed my life profoundly. And the development of my own style has been in turn the result of that deeper sense of what it is to be a human being," end quote. While Levertov doesn't elaborate on the meaning of this spiritual influence, her comment to Reid invites a fuller consideration of Williams's impact. His thoughts about the imagination, for starters, functions as a critical source for this influence, as Levertov grapples with his ideas through her poetic and faith journey. Although matters of faith are not as explicit in Williams's verse, Wendell Berry reminds us that he did not back away from words such as eternal, worship, holiness, grace, sacred, and faith, and contends that Williams's conception of the imagination rests upon the assumption that we are eternal creatures to which only imagination can awaken us. The eternal properties of this imaginative awakening are envisioned in Spring and All, as Williams asks readers to imagine the new world that rises to our windows from the sea and its counterpart in our souls. This correlation between the new world and the soul serves as the starting point for this essay's consideration of the ways that Levertov and Williams explore the sacredness of the imagination in their verse. Williams addresses Spring and All to a single force, the imagination. He describes it as the force that enables us to, quote, refine, clarify, and to intensify that internal moment in which we alone live. As indicated by Williams's plural pronoun, this force is not insular, but one that invites others into a communion-like state. In the imagination, Williams writes, we are from henceforth, so long as you read, locked in a fraternal embrace, the classic caress of author and reader. We are one. In the subsequent but non-sequential chapter 19, Williams engages readers in an imagining exercise. At first, Williams invites us to see the world around us as a new world and its capacity to connect to some more intuitive aspect of our daily existence. His use of the word soul conveys the depth of an imagining that releases something visually brilliant and musically freeing. As the passage continues, the speaker pushes the bounds of absurdity, world destruction, to achieve this imaginative state. He struggles to explain, quote, if I could say what is in my mind in Sanskrit or even Latin, I would do so, he admits, but I cannot. His confession is telling. Those ancient religious languages seem outmoded as he attempts to, quote, speak for the integrity of the soul and the greatness of life's inanity, end quote. Once the destruction is complete, the imagination emerges supreme. Destruction, however, is not the purpose of this exercise. The end is not the end. By clearing the world of everything but these basic building blocks, Williams creates a setting for something new and imaginative to take root. Keeping in mind the post-war context of Spring and All, Williams asks us to envision a new world. He also explains that his purpose has been for all for love, for sweetest love, that together the human race, yellow, black, brown, red, and white, agglutinated into one enormous soul, may be gratified with the sight and retire to the heaven of heavens, content to rest on its laurels. Despite the absurdity of the annihilatory call, Williams's passage reflects an imaginative bonding of people, reminiscent of his earlier invitation for readers to join him in a fraternal embrace. It's a union that breaks down barriers to forge a soul-like state that is part of the great being of eternity. That body-soul agglutination parallels the emergence of spring by the stinking river that can be described, quote, both in Latin and Turkish, in English and Dutch, in Japanese and Italian, end quote. In her essay, The Ideas and Things, Levertov considers one of the poems from Spring and All, The Farmer Deep in Thought, which we've already seen and heard, to engage Williams's ideas about the imagination. As Levertov points out, Williams's farmer is not idly sitting back in his farmhouse thinking about this place, but in direct, active contact with the fields he will cultivate. The enjambment of these lines heightens his connectedness to this landscape during a seemingly lifeless transitional time. Below the surface, though, things are happening, not only in the blank fields, but within the farmer's mind. As Levertov suggests, he's left quite alone with his imagination. Williams's farmer ultimately emerges as the artist figure of the farmer composing, yet this figure is also antagonist. They are one and the same, for this farmer artist must work with and against forces that counter each other in the cultivation of new imaginative work. Wendell Berry contends that the poem represents an eternal moment in which the poet is clearly and immensely aware of what he is seeing. This moment is not only the farmer's, but also the poet who creates the poem and the readers who envision it. In a reading of the poem, Levertov asserts that too often readers misunderstand Williams's famous dictum, no ideas but in things, quote, acknowledging only a utilitarian role for the literal, rather than perceiving concrete images as the very incarnation of thought. Levertov's argument can be traced to her earlier comments in The Poet and the World, when she argues that no ideas but in things does not mean no ideas. It means, and here I quote Wordsworth, that language is not the dress, but the incarnation of thoughts. The poem itself is the incarnation. Levertov contends that Williams' dictum means only essentially only connect, and it is therefore only not only a craft statement, not only an aesthetic statement, but a moral statement. Only connect, no ideas but in things. The words reverberate through the poet's life, through my life, and I hope through your lives, end quote. Levertov celebrates the power of this connection in her poem, Williams, an essay. For the sake of time, I will only focus on her concluding lines. He loved the lotus cup, fragrant upon the swaying water, loved the wily mud, pressing swart riches into its roots, and the long stem of connection. The image of a fragrant lotus cup floating upon water encapsulates Williams's work. Levertov knows that he did not love just surface beauty, but the less aesthetically pleasing mud that enriches its roots and the stem that joins them together. That final word, connection, offers a final resting place for what Levertov believes Williams's work can provide us all, over and over again. Levertov's emphasis on this connection, whether it's through language, place, or each other, offers a key to a poet who invites us to plunge below surfaces to discover the wonder and value inherent in the things around us. It's an imaginative engagement with our world that ultimately opens us to a more profound way of thinking and being. In his afterword to her selected poems, Paul Lacey contends that Levertov's poem, quote, celebrates what Williams loved, persistence linked to invention and the long stem of connection. And her essays document his craft as a stepping stone of the imagination toward her own mature practice, end quote. Towards the close of Spring and All, Williams describes the imagination as an actual force compared to electricity or steam. It's a power that can be used to, quote, raise the understanding of it is not necessary to resort to mysticism. In fact, it is this which has kept back the knowledge I seek. It's a fascinating line to consider from Springinall. Williams interrupts himself and acknowledges that this power sounds like a mystical force, but he's not there yet. Such a descriptor for him suggests a traditional explanation for the power that he is describing. It's not necessary to resort to that word. However, what Williams describes seems related, but not contingent upon such a framework of thought. As he continues, he asserts that the value of the imagination consists in its ability to make words, its unique power to give created forms reality, actual existence. In this way, the imagination gains incarnation through the poem. It would not be disconnected from reality, but immersed in it. As Williams suggests, imagination is not to avoid reality, nor its description, nor an evocation of objects or situations. It is to say that poetry does not tamper with the world, but moves it. It creates a new object, a play, a dance, which is not a mirror up to nature, but in this way, the incarnation of the imagination creates something new in the world that has the capacity to move those who engage it towards something new in their own lives. In her essay, Williams and the Duende, Levertov considers another aspect of Williams's verse that she claims many students fail to recognize or discover, specifically those big questions: how to live, what to do. For Levertov, Williams's style has value, but there is so much more to him, ! That she includes. She describes his depth in terms of music, magic, and duende. In trying to explain her use of this term, she suggests that she may mean soul, and references the closing lines of Williams's The Sound of Waves. In these lines, as Levertov notes, the speaker, quote, arrives at the edge of the world where all is unknown, undefined, the abyss of the gods, from there at last beyond the human, end quote. It's beyond this known world that a voice speaks to the poet. Levertov calls attention to the profundity of these lines with its echoes of Williams's The Wanderer, a poem that depicts a young poet's baptism within the filthy Passaic. Not surprisingly, Levertov shares the belief with Williams that authentic creative artistry is rooted in the imagination. To access this source, there needs to be an openness to what Levertov describes as the mystery of inspiration, and links the imagination to her belief in God. The concept, and this is Levertov as she explains in A Poet's View, the concept of inspiration presupposes a power which enters the individual and is not a personal attribute, and it is linked to a view of the artist's life as one of obedience to a vocation. Later, that unknown began to be defined for me as God, and further, as God revealed in the incarnation. Levertov's assertion marks a distinction from Williams, who never spoke so directly about the ties between God and this poetic inspiration. It reflects a sharpening of Levertov's perception about the divine nature of the imagination. I'm going to switch to a poem that Levertov wrote called On Belief in the Physical Resurrection of Jesus. It's an important poem to consider. In the poem A Sacrament, Professor Albert Gelpi describes it as, quote, one that, quote, brings Levertov full circle back to Williams, but with the incarnational vision she has arrived at on her pilgrimage, end quote. Professor Gelpi's observation of Williams's importance to this poem is critical for understanding the ways that the Rutherford Doctor mattered to Levertov and informed her poetic development and faith journey. Levertov's poem considers the subject of miracles. She alludes to Marianne Moore's description of the literalists of the imagination, as she asserts a belief in miracles as possible and essential. She then asks a series of rhetorical questions about those who profess to possess such a belief and are unable to consider the miracle of Christ's resurrection. The speaker urges, we must feel the pulse in the wound to believe that with God, all things are possible. as she alludes to Thomas's touching of Christ's crucifixion wounds, and a communion-like image to taste bread at Emmaus that warm hands broke and blessed. With that final image of warm hands breaking and blessing bread, Levertov offers a powerful closing to her poem. Williams's The Host, a poem included in the Desert Music, offers an intriguing point of comparison to this poem. In his New York Times book review, Kenneth Rexroth describes The Host as an explicit statement of the sacramental nature of reality. The poem portrays the convergence at a railway restaurant of an evangelist and his party, two young Irish nuns, a white-haired Anglican, and the poet. All are believers who have come to this restaurant from different places in search of food and drink necessary for continuing their travels. It is all, as the speaker notes, since eat we must, made sacred by our common need. The sacredness of this common need speaks to something that unites this formal gathering of religious people. Although theologically not all of them believe in transubstantiation, Cristina Giorcelli writes, they are all there to partake of the host laid for them and for me by the tired waitresses. This place, like their faith in God, sustains them, provides renewal and refreshment. Williams writes, there's nothing to eat, seek it where you will, but of the body of the Lord. Their consumption, like their belief in Christ, is contingent upon sacrifice, albeit the sacrifice of animals, quote, who suffer and die that we may live, end quote. In this real way, the stop at this restaurant satisfies their hunger and leaves the speaker referencing Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. God has provided for them. It may not be the roots in the bone and blood that Levertov alludes to when discussing miracles. However, it is a physical manifestation of a belief rooted in the imagination. Williams's speaker seems to acknowledge this when exclaiming, only the imagination is real, exclamation point. They have imagined it, therefore it is so, end quote. Besides their consumption of the meal, these different restaurant patrons share a belief with the poet in the power of the imagination. This recognition, though, is never shared among these believers. There are only looks, the smiles of the docile women of the party, the nun's young face cut off at the brow, the Anglican plainly from a good school. As the poet confesses, I had only my eyes with which to speak. His poem, though, his words communicate the sacredness of this impromptu gathering in the railway's restaurant. The host highlights the important role that the poet can play communicating the sacredness of the imagination. Before the poem's conclusion, he contends, no one was there save only for the food, which I alone, being a poet, could have given them. Again, according to Cristina Giorcelli, in the lyrical eye's opinion, only certain individuals, poets and artists, may adequately respond to such a need, because being gifted with the imagination, thanks to this force, they may deliver the food that is needed. Levertov seems to echo such a belief in her poem when she describes a belief in miracles by those literalists of the imagination. It's the power of the imagination that fuels a belief in miracles, a belief that makes it possible to taste bread at Emmaus each time a believer accepts a consecrated host. Levertov's poem, like Williams's The Host, conveys such a truth. And I'll conclude. In Levertov, Williams discovered a kindred poetic spirit. Despite their different backgrounds and faith journeys, they shared a common belief in the sacredness of the imagination. It's a force that Williams celebrated in Spring and All and devoted a lifetime to exploring throughout his works. As evident in collections like the Desert Music, he continuously sought new ways to express this imaginative force through poems that probed the constructs of religious beliefs. Levertov understood this. While Williams did not direct her religious journey, he walked with her for a time and showed her the ways that the imagination can find incarnation in the word, no ideas, but in things. His belief in the rootedness of this imagination in reality also served as a stepping stone in the ways that she envisioned the truths of her beliefs, Christ's sacrifice and resurrection, as a manifestation that, with God, quote, all things are possible, end quote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cappucci. It's been a beautiful presentation. Thank you to both of you. Before giving some time to the Q&A, I'd like to allude to a very interesting idea you have both spoken about, which is spring and all in the end is this poetic manifesto of imagination, right? For Williams, the value of imagination is actually making words. And following what Dr. Martínez Serrano has suggested, by naming things, they come into existence. So in the end, there is a connection between imagination with this imagination, with poetic imagination. We build a poem, and with these words, by naming things, things become real. We create a reality. So these two terms, imagination and reality, seem to be like opposites, but in the end, for Williams, they work perfectly together, which is quite an interesting idea. So thank you very much. I don't know if anyone in the audience would like to ask something. Any student? I hope students are learning a lot from today's sessions, and I hope you really like them, because this is a great opportunity for you to be listening to people from other countries, from other universities. So then I've got a question for you too. It's kind of like a double question. According to what you have suggested in your presentations, do you think that Williams's imagination actually became a source for Levertov's spirituality? In the sense of, do you think Williams's definition of poetic imagination prompted her, let's say, spirituality in the poetry she wrote? And the other related question would be that if you think that Williams's intention was actually to create a poetic legacy, as in the poem, as you have suggested, Professor Cappucci, becomes an eternal moment. So do you think, both of you, that he wanted to create a legacy? So Dr. Martínez, if you would like to begin.
Yeah, sure. Those are difficult questions. So yes, Williams's concept, I would say Williams's conceptualization of the imaginations certainly had some kind of impact on Denise Levertov's conceptualization of imagination as well. I'm not an expert on Levertov. I should begin by saying this, but I think she was really interested in the poetic legacy that Williams created throughout an entire life. What seems to be common to the two of them is that the imagination is central to poetry, to the art of poetry. So Professor Cappucci has already emphasized several times in the course of his presentation that the imagination was sacred to both poets. But obviously the imagination was not a departure from reality, but quite the opposite. It was immersion in reality. At least that seems to be the case with the poems in Spring and all that I have analyzed. So it's not an excuse to escape reality, but rather to immerse oneself in the materiality of things, even though the very materiality of things bespeaks some kind of spirituality. I know this may sound paradoxical or contradictory, but I can't find better words to express what I intend to say. Well, obviously, Williams has invested a lot of time and energy into the writing of his work. So obviously, I think it was part of his agenda, was on his agenda, this idea of creating a poetic legacy. Alberto, that was your second question. He was a practicing doctor and a poet at the same time. But poetry to him, and this is a point I've tried to make in my presentation, poetry to him was also a form of knowing reality, making sense of reality. Poetry as meaning making seems to be quite central to his artistic undertaking, to his poetical endeavor. So yes, and my answer to the second question is yes. My answer is affirmative. He was interested in creating a poetic legacy of lasting value to posterity. And as for the first question, just to summarize my answer, is probably Williams's conception of what imagination is or was of paramount importance to Levertov's conceptualization of imagination as well. But just let me repeat that I'm not an expert on Levertov, so this is quite a tentative answer to that question. Just let me highlight the importance, the centrality of imagination to Williams's poetics. And I would say that Spring and All is a series of variations that Williams's essays in his attempt at defining the concept of imagination, because it's hard to define, don't you think? So those are my tentative answers to these two questions. I might further elaborate on them as I listen to Cappucci's answers to these two questions as well.
I think you're right on as far as those responses. I think just this idea of legacy, whether it's intentional or not, I think Williams cared very much about the future of poetry in America, and really seems to serve as a mentor or guide for so many poets of this generation, Levertov being one of them, but thinking about other poets like Allen Ginsberg or Robert Creeley. And I talk a little bit about Frank O'Hara, although they never met each other. O'Hara takes so much away from what Williams is writing and thinking about. But I think the correspondence of Williams with so many different younger poets reflects, I don't know if it's legacy, but he cares about where poetry is going, and maybe connecting to that earlier question about the imagination, sort of how it gets expressed for a new generation, continues to be explored and represented in a new generation. And as far as Levertov, I am no expert on Levertov either. And I find her fascinating in terms of her faith journey, given her background, her religious background, coming from England to the States. And I think she was and again, in just my humble perspective, learning from people as she was exploring what faith meant, what the imagination meant. So I think she takes from a lot of sources, but Williams becomes a very close mentor, as I think you see in Professor McGowan's collection of letters between Williams and Levertov. The depth of their relationship is really powerful. And so I do think she takes from him, but she's taking from a lot of people as she's exploring the what the imagination means in her work.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Dr. Martinez, would you like to add something?
I was thinking about a passage that has somehow has been mentioned by Professor Cappucci in his presentation, in his paper. He referred to chapter 19, which is a fascinating topic. There's a quotation which I think is, fascinating. It's apocalyptic. Let me read it for you, because I'd like to know what Professor Cappucci thinks about this particular passage. This is to me, and this is my humble interpretation, this seems to be an apocalyptic vision of the world, a world which has been stripped of human presence. I will read it to you. There's in chapter 19, the voice that we get to hear in Spring and All talks about our secret project, and the secret project amounts to the annihilation of every human creature on the face of the earth, none to remain, nothing but the lower vertebrates, the mollusks, insects, and plants. Then at last will the world be made anew. Houses crumble to ruins, cities disappear, giving place to mounds of soil blown thither by the winds. Small bushes and grass give way to trees which grow old and are succeeded by other trees for countless generations. A marvelous serenity, broken only by bird and wild beast calls, reigns over the entire sphere. Order and peace abound. It was like an apocalyptic vision of a world with there are no human beings. And because Professor Cappucci has referred to chapter 19, I was wondering what he makes of this particular passage, because it was apocalyptic to me. It was, if you look at it from the perspective of the current environmental crisis, it was something awkward and about this particular quotation I've just shared with you.
Yeah, I agree with you that it's this apocalyptic sort of call. And I know when teaching this work, this is the passage that students are like, oh my God, he's talking about the destruction of the world, like a totally, this annihilation. And we maybe get at this idea of it's all an imaginative sort of stripping it down, bringing it back to basics. And the only way I'm using this phrasing of like an imagining exercise, that chapter begins with, imagine the new world that rises to our windows every day, our windows from the sea on Mondays and on Saturdays, on every day in between. And it's this repetition of imagine, imagine, imagine. And then it results in that buildup that you read, which it's almost as though once everything is destroyed, then something new can emerge. And I'm fascinated with that magnolia tree that's growing by the stinking river, where before what was once a farmhouse, now a ramshackle home for mill workers. And just thinking about New Jersey, like that landscape that he talks about, how the landscape has been industrialized and transformed, but still that magnolia tree is blooming. That there's something, I don't know what to make of that, but it's interesting that that's where this chapter ends. This almost is this transformation of the landscape, but still there is this magnolia tree that emerges with blooming trees by the ramshackle home for mill workers. Yeah, I don't know if that offers anything, but it is a fascinating passage to look at.
Yeah, so actually we share the same sense of fascination. Yes, it's pastelin. It somehow foreshadows environmental catastrophe, but then it has to be read against the historical backdrop, which is a heavily industrialized America. So, but when I came across this passage, I thought to myself, "Wow, there's something very special about this."
Yeah. And I was interested. He uses that word "love." The final and self-inflicted Holocaust has been all for love, and there's that's an intro. I'm still sort of trying to tease that out as well.
So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to listen to this amazing, wonderful talk. It's a shame it has come to an end. But I'm really grateful for having you here, although online, but still present. And thank you also. I would like to thank the organizers also for having created this conference, for having invited you. because they have provided us the opportunity, to having you here with us with these amazing presentations on William Carlos Williams and Denise Levertov. Just before we say goodbye again, I would like to remind you that there is a 30-minute break, and I will see you again at 5:30 with the following panel. And once again, Professor Cappucci and Dr. Martínez Serrano, thank you very much for your presentations. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a great honor to share this panel with Professor Cappucci, and it was a very nice conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for making all this happen. And I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll see you in 30 minutes.